Joining me now is Democratic Congresswoman Abigail Spanberger of Virginia, former CIA case officer. Congresswoman, what more can the U.S. be doing? We've seen an aggressive attempt by the State Department, but they've only just, a week ago, wrongfully, declared him wrongfully detained. And Paul Whelan, who's been in jail for 4 years on a 16-year sentence for spying, also falsely, according to everyone, the State Department himself. His family is now saying he feels abandoned, that he's been left behind twice before by high-profile detainees, Trevor Reed and Brittany Griner getting out, and he's still there.
So, Andrea, you're speaking to the tragedy of Americans held behind bars in countries like Russia. And we know that you mentioned Mr. Whelan, you mentioned the Wall Street Journal journalist. The reality is that Americans are being held throughout the world by regimes like Russia and other adversary nations, and the State Department has and must continue to aggressively work for their release. Notably, in the case of journalists, more than 500 journalists worldwide are currently being detained for doing their journalistic work. And certainly in the case of American journalists, as a former CIA officer, now as a member of the House Intelligence Committee, I can tell you that we were always very, very clear that the CIA, when we were overseas, when we were at home, we went nowhere near American journalists because they were doing their work. We had a prohibition, a very clear one, on ever even engaging, so that, if someone was on to us, it never linked back to true journalists like Evan. And so it's just an absolute horror what is happening to him, and I expect the State Department to work aggressively and tirelessly to get him and every other detained American home.
And, of course, Vladimir Putin is achieving the purpose of getting others to be reluctant to go, or if they go, be very worried about what they can say for fear. And we have the fact of Vladimir Kara-Murza, who is the only remaining, very prominent critic, because Navalny's been in jail, and his people say that he might be even slowly being poisoned. So Kara-Murza was sentenced to 25 years yesterday. He's a Washington Post contributor. So he is silenced.
This is exactly the purpose of a regime like Russia's regime, Putin's efforts to ensure that no information is getting out, that there is no sunlight shed on the atrocities that are being managed by the Russian government in Ukraine and elsewhere. Efforts to mislead the Russian people about their war that they are waging in Ukraine. And so those who have been bringing light, be they Russian nationals or Americans or other nationalities, those who have, the kind of solemn duty of keeping their neighbors, global or domestic, informed, Russia seeks to silence them. They silence dissent, and now they're silencing journalists, and it is absolutely certainly antithetical to American values, which is why, in addition to the reality that there are Americans being held in Russian prisons, that we also need to stand up for journalistic freedoms, because they are just foundational to freedom worldwide.
Let me ask you about the Air National Guardsman in Massachusetts. He was in court very briefly. He's still on being held without bail. So questions are being raised about whether his top secret clearance gave him access to some of the highly secret, no foreign use, supposedly, segmented intelligence about foreign leaders, electronic intelligence, or whether he was just so adept being an IT guy that he could get around whatever barriers existed. Do you know yet which it is?
So I don't yet know which it is, but I think there's multiple questions here. Certainly, was he given access to something that he shouldn't have had access to? Or in the event that he might have just been able to gain access because of his, IT know-how, what precautions were not in place in this circumstance, that there weren't red flags, that this man who might have been accessing information, even if he had access to it and rightful access to it, certainly arguably whether he should have had it or not, but even if he was accessing information that at the time he was allowed to access, how was he able to do that kind of outside of his job function? And those are some serious questions that we have, certainly that I have as a member of the Intelligence Committee as we conduct oversight on this issue, because we have to understand how he was able to gain access to this information, what efforts he was able to undertake on the system, is so that we can, learn from this and moving forward ensure that no person with the types of intentions he had of sharing classified information is able to do so. And notably, there has to be an assessment of what CI efforts, counterintelligence efforts were in place, because this man clearly had anti-government thoughts and intentions, and how was that not putting him on the radar of security individuals within his agency?
You're going to get a briefing this afternoon, the entire House and Senate. Are we sure that Russian operatives, one has been already named, who had access to this stuff and might have been distorting it? Could Russia, China, or other adversaries have been using these documents to work against our interests?
I mean, Russia and the Chinese Communist Party are working against our interests on a daily basis in a variety of ways, but certainly having access to classified information, whether they distorted it or not, the very fact that it's been released allows them an extra tool in their toolbox as they seek to either misinform the public or sow disinformation campaigns and division campaigns.
Congresswoman Abigail Spanberger, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you to all the journalists.